Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here, and I thought I would do this video on the other side of climate change because a ways back when I did Invisible Empire, I actually had a large section about the United Nations, the IPCC, and the scandal that was going on at the time called Climategate. It's a long forgotten scandal for some reasons, and people almost never reference it or talk about it, which kind of boggles my mind. But at the same time, when I did Shade the Motion Picture a couple years later, I did stuff on geoengineering, bioengineering, and yes, the larger agenda of this, which is really population control and eugenics. Now, although we're going to get to some of that because we're going to play at least a small excerpt of Invisible Empire, this is the article that really triggered this video. So, I was doing my normal thing and going through the news feed the other day, and I saw this headline: Republicans give platform to climate science deniers at hearing on biodiversity. Now, myself being called a conspiracy theorist, a 9/11 denier, a climate change denier, all this nonsense, all these talking points out there, I thought to myself, why not read a little bit of this article and then show you what these guys actually said? Because what don't they do in this article? Well, they don't show you the evidence presented. And although we're not going to do the whole hearing, both Moore and the other gentleman, two people that they brought in, got 5 minutes apiece, so that's about 10 minutes. And we're going to go over it and break it down. But first, let's read some of this Guardian article. And, I like some of the Guardian's work. Other work by them I could not care for, and this is some of it. The climate crisis has become a top issue among Democrats running for president, but many Republican lawmakers are still resistant to the science showing that global heating is a serious man-made problem. When Democrats in control of the House have scheduled a hearing for international scientists to explain their warnings that humans are critically wounding biodiversity, on Wednesday, conservative members of Congress called on career climate science deniers to testify alongside them. While a small but growing number of moderate conservatives acknowledge the urgency of the man-made problem, it's always man-made problem, many Republican members in the House of Representatives in leadership positions do not. Republicans on Natural Resources Subcommittee called two prominent science deniers to criticize a landmark report that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, largely because of humans, including because of rising temperatures from fossil fuel use and other unsustainable activities. I'm going to stop it there for a minute. When he goes into the 1 million species that are at risk, you'll find out that the majority of these are species that have never been discovered, that are on computer models, okay, that are guesses, that's not real science, okay? Talk about hypothesis and unproven. Oh my goodness, it's absolutely stunning what they're able to get away with. So let me continue on in this. Let's see. The conservatives invited Mark Morano, who founded a website to question climate science, and Patrick Moore, the chairman of CO2 Coalition, which falsely argues that more carbon is good for the planet. So you know what? We're just going to get to it. We're going to play what these guys actually said, and then you're going to make your own decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was not until the early 1900s, marked by the extinction of the passenger pigeon in 1914, that the general public began to take a keen interest in the subject of species extinction. This awakening was inspired by the early activism of Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, and Gifford Pinchot. Next slide after that. Thus, our species, Homo sapiens, became the first and only species to be concerned about the survival of all species on Earth. To the best of our knowledge, the only home for life in the universe. As a result of this now international concern, institutions have been created to identify endangered species and to develop programs to prevent their extinction. In the past century, there has been a marked decline in the number of extinctions as these programs have been implemented. Fewer than 900 extinctions have been documented in the 500 years since 1500 AD. About 95% of them were on islands. In February 1999, National Geographic published a chart showing the 5 major extinction events during the past 600 million years. It clearly shows that the number of taxonomic families of life have steadily increased over this time. They warned of a 6th mass extinction driven by humanity. Number 6 on the graph notes that beetles, amphibians, birds, and large mammals are the hardest hit. I asked the editors, why does the line turn fuzzy at the end? I knew that no taxonomic families have gone extinct in modern times. They replied, but did not explain the fuzziness. The downturn at the end of the graph is purely bogus. There is good paleontology for the 5 major extinctions, during which 50 to 90% of all existing species became extinct. There is zero evidence that any such event is occurring now or has even begun to occur.
So let's stop it there. You notice like none of his presentation or his actual arguments were addressed in that article. Do you see that? You know, he's just a denier. He's a Republican. He's giving out false information. You know, again, I'm looking at his stuff. We should at least hear the other side of the argument, don't you think? Let's continue.
There are 3 primary causes of species extinction by humans. 1, overhunting for food and purposeful eradication of pests. 2, massive clearing of native ecosystems for food and fiber production. Vast fields of corn are grown for biofuel due to green priorities. Equally vast expanses of land have been converted, next slide, and then the next slide, to palm oil plantations for biodiesel. Next slide. The same is true of massive solar farms, next slide, covering land that could be rich in native species. These policies must be reconsidered. 3, the introduction of exotic predators such as rats, cats, foxes, and snakes, especially on islands where this has been the greatest cause of extinction in recent years.
Do you see that? Do you see that? Non-indigenous species causing the greatest part of this extinction, not the man-made climate change that is pumped down our throats.
The IPBES claims that there are 8 million species, yet only 1.8 million species have been identified and named. Thus, the IPBES believes there are 6.2 million unidentified and unnamed species. Therefore, 1 million of the unknown species could go extinct overnight, and we would not notice it because we would not have known they existed. This is highly unprofessional, still stated politely.
Let's stop that. Think about how insane that is. They're claiming 8 million species are at risk of extinction, can't name 6.2 of them, the vast majority of them, and yet we're supposed to just believe this, and he makes a great point. If that were the case and they were to go extinct, we wouldn't know. How would we know? They haven't been identified yet.
Scientists should not, in fact, cannot predict estimates of endangered species or species extinction based on millions of unnamed species. This is not a new phenomenon. The so-called 6th great extinction has predicted for decades. It has not come to pass, similar to virtually every doomsday prediction made in human history. The IUCN is the only international observer organization in the UN General Assembly specifically concerned with biodiversity and nature protection. My organization, the CO2 Coalition, finds the IUCN findings on biodiversity and endangered species to be far more credible than those of the IBPPS, which are not credible in the slightest. It is quite clear that the highly exaggerated claims of the IPBES are not so much out of concern for endangered species as they are for a front for radical political, social, and economic transformation of our entire civilization. Their recommendation for an end to economic growth alone condemns the developing world to increased poverty and suffering.
Guy's killing it right now, in my opinion. Remember, he's only got 5 minutes. He puts together this very, very quick presentation. But those are the aspects of climate change and the business of climate change and the actual use towards globalization of the climate change agenda. He's talking about all of it here.
Appealing to the green urban class, the IPBES recommends urban agriculture and rooftop gardens as part of their transformational agenda. No mention is made of eliminating millions, hundreds of millions of acres of former native ecosystems converted to biofuel plantations and solar farms. As with the manufactured climate crisis, they are using the specter of mass extinction as a fear tactic to scare the public into compliance. The IPBES itself is an existential threat to sensible policy on biodiversity conservation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this subject.
Now, why couldn't we just hear some of that in this article? Why wasn't any of that, not one bit of his presentation mentioned? Why wasn't it? Not any, guys, I promise you, none of that. None of that. This is the closest thing. This is the closest thing to a quote we're going to get. The latest UN appeal for more money and more regulatory control of the economy and people's lives. And that's from Morano. You don't even get a quote from Moore. Okay? Think about that. It's unbelievable to me that you can smear somebody in that way and not mention one thing they said at this hearing. So let's continue. Let's go right to Morano, who starts almost immediately after this, and hear what he has to say.
I want to thank the House Resources Committee for this opportunity. My background is in political science, which happens to be an ideal background for examining yet another United Nations environmental report. And in my written submission, I have all the scientists, within minutes, hours of this report being released, scientists from around the world started questioning the numbers and the extrapolations and the estimates from the United Nations, pointing out that since 1870, species extinctions have actually been in decline. And these are basically computer models of species we don't even know exist, how they're extrapolating that. But beyond that, the key I want to focus on in my testimony here is, as an investigative journalist studying the United Nations, and I've been to nearly every UN environmental climate conference in the last 2 decades, including the Earth Summit in Johannesburg and the Earth Summit in Rio in 2012, I have been a student of the United Nations. And in my book, I actually feature the politically incorrect guide to climate change, the poster child of endangered species, the polar bear surfing on a wave. And we'll get to what happened to the polar bear in a minute as the icon of the global warming movement. But in terms of this latest United Nations report, it is a very thinly veiled attempt to hype, distort biodiversity concerns, which there are many legitimate ones, but not as presented by the United Nations. It's the latest UN appeal to give it more money, more power, more scientific authority, more money, and more regulatory control of the economy and people's lives. The UN Species Report requires, quote, a huge transformation is needed across the economy to protect and restore nature. What kind of a huge transformation are we talking about? Well, the UN in its press release invoked authoritative science, and that is, of course, produced by the United Nations. The UN Executive Secretary declared it presents authoritative science to decision makers for their consideration. At best, the US science represents nothing more than authoritative bureaucracy. A more accurate term would be authoritative propaganda.
Boom! I love that. So again, we're talking about a political movement. We're talking about a movement towards globalization where science can be fudged and fiddled with, and you can just make up 6.2 million species that you haven't identified and say they're endangered, and call for more regulation and more control under this auspice of a world governance or a large governing body to tell us how much CO2 we're allowed to release. Now, we're not talking about real environmental issues because they're out there. They're out there, okay? We do put some fucking terrible shit into our water, into our air. Absolutely. Absolutely. But when we're talking about a carbon footprint and we're talking about a life force on this planet, something that we all take part on, zero carbon. And I saw Jeff Bezos talking about zero carbon this week, one of the stories we didn't do. I should have brought that up. That there's a clip of him talking about getting to zero carbon. You know who else talks about that? Bill Gates, getting to zero carbon. You know who else talks about that? The United Nations and globalists. So let's continue.
And the reason I say that is we have the head. This is modeled after the climate panel, the IPCC. The former chair, Robert Watson, is here. Another former chair of Agenda Pachari declared global warming was his religion. This was the chair of the alleged science panel of the United Nations on climate. Another top UN IPCC official explained that we will redistribute the world's wealth by climate policy. You have to free oneself of the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. It almost has nothing to do with environmental policy anymore. That was Otto Edenhofer, a UN official, telling you that this is essentially the UN, a self-interested organization lobbying for political change. We have the former UN chief Christiana Figueres, who I've interviewed for the book, talking about, we seek a centralized transformation that will make life on planet Earth very different, using hyped environmental scares. I go back to the 1960s and show that from overpopulation, deforestation, global cooling, resource scarcity, no matter the environmental scare, the solution was always the same: wealth redistribution, central planning, and sovereignty limiting treaties. So what I'm here today is to tell you, I'm not here to give some vague critique of the United Nations. I'm here to tell you that the three lead authors here, or the three top officials from the UN, are part of this con that the United Nations presents itself as the world's expert on scientists, the world's leading authorities. The standards by which these summary for policymakers are issued, they actually have line by line, has to be agreed on by UN bureaucrats, politicians, and then the underlying report, which hasn't been released yet on the species, has to be made in line with what was agreed to by the political class. This is not a scientific process, and in fact, in my testimony, I show how it violates the Department of Energy's own standards for U.S. science to be taken seriously on this, to be violating our own scientific standards. One point on the polar bears, Al Gore mentioned them and featured them as an icon in his first movie. His sequel in 2017 didn't mention polar bears once. They are at or near historic population highs. So I'm not talking about the UN vaguely. I'm talking about Sir Robert Watson here, Edward Brandizio, Dr. Shin. They are the leaders of this UN politicization of species endangerment science. They are fully engaged in using what they claim to be authoritative science to lobby for more power and expanding control of the United Nations. Dr. Watson actually says the future of humanity depends on action now. Dr. Watson, sitting next to me, or Sir Robert Watson, is claiming the United Nations can identify the problem, put itself in charge of the solution. He says it's our last chance to save the planet. These are the words of a salesman, a science bureaucrat, not a disinterested...
I'd like to ask the witness to direct your testimony to the chair and not to your fellow
Dr. Watson, though, these are the words of not a scientist, but of a science bureaucrat doing the bidding for his organization, just as he did during the Climategate scandal. They trotted him out on all the TVs.
Thank you, Mr. Morano.
To say nothing to be seen here.
I'm glad he brought up the Climategate scandal at the end there, because that's exactly where we are about to go. So I think he did a bang-up job. You can watch that whole thing on YouTube. I think it had something like less than 2,000 views. That's one of the reasons I go out and find this stuff. C-SPAN actually didn't have this clip. You guys know that I do a lot of C-SPAN diving. Did find it on YouTube, but we have to give this a larger audience, because these are the headlines. I can tell you right now, tens of thousands of people read this article. And this came out 2-3 days ago, after the hearing on Wednesday, and it was just skewed in one direction and one direction only. Now, he talks about the climate change scandal. So here we're going to go to my page right here on the home. We have my documentary Invisible Empire from 2010. And let's talk about that climate change scandal.
State Building, once a proud symbol of the United States, was lit in the colors of the Communist Party halfway across the world. In fact, following the United Nations Copenhagen Conference in December of 2009, the Washington Post ran the headline, "Copenhagen Climate Deal Shows New World Order May Be Led by U.S., China." The Copenhagen Conference was disguised as a summit that would save the planet from man-made global warming by cutting carbon emissions. When taking a look at the almost 200-page document that was being proposed, it becomes evident that this was yet another attempt to establish global government and set up a global tax. In Section 38, it states, "The scheme for the new institutional arrangement under the Convention will be based on 3 basic pillars: government, facilitative mechanism, and financial mechanism." In Section 47, subsection F, it discusses cap-and-trade schemes and carbon taxes and the use of new and existing flexible carbon market mechanisms. These cap-and-trade schemes were just that, a scheme to further transfer the wealth from the poor to the ultra-rich.
One of the ways it will drive the change is through global governance and global agreements.
The fact that our president even attended should be considered treason. Just weeks before the conference, Climategate hit the media. Secret emails confirm that many of the United Nations lead scientists had engaged in fraud in order to promote the idea that man-made global warming was occurring and that carbon dioxide was a toxic gas. In reality, they admitted the Earth had been cooling for the last decade and that they had destroyed the source data in order to ensure the scientific community would be unable to review their findings.
Think about that. And you know, a lot of people often get on me about not putting links in the descriptions. But guys, the more stuff I put in there, the less chance this has to get out there, because once something's demonetized, it just doesn't get recommended. I'm going to show you how 4 of my last 5 videos have been demonetized. And that simply just hurts the numbers and the growth of this information, period. So you look at that article. I think that was the Sunday Times, I'm pretty sure. Almost sure it was Sunday Times. But again, you Google that, you Google this, and you read it. Yeah, they dumped the data. Yeah, the emails did say from 1998 to 2008 the Earth had been cooling. Something they never talk about.
Bill Jones was forced to resign from his position at East Anglia University, and Penn State has launched an investigation into Michael Mann. Because of the scandal, many countries refused to sign the agreement, and instead only 25 heads of state, including rock star president and savior Barack Obama, signed a much shorter and broader accord. The document states that a high-level panel will be created, and that parties will be subject to domestic auditing, supervision, and assessment.
The climate conference in Copenhagen is another step towards the global management of our planet.
The idea that carbon dioxide, the life force for plants here on Earth, is a toxic gas and should be taxed is laughable. There have been numerous periods of time in which the Earth has had vastly more carbon in the atmosphere than present day. In areas where there have been volcanic eruptions which emit large amounts of CO2, plants have benefited, and there is no negative impact on the surrounding environment, as well as indigenous people from the excess carbon dioxide. The globalists promote this theory to keep mankind in fear, not only for the establishment of a global government and a global carbon tax, but the literal control of the entire planet. An even darker side to the scam of man-made global warming exists. In reality, it's about population control.
So let's stop it there. We just told you why the UN, the IPCC, should not be trusted. We showed you how they were caught in a Climategate scandal over a decade ago now that the media has largely swept under the rug. Remember, you can watch this whole film for free at this page right here. But now you're going to find out that, hey, wait a minute. This has a little bit more to do with population control and eugenics than it does climate change.
Ted Turner reveals himself here in this interview with Charlie Rose.
We've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there were
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. We've got to stabilize population on a voluntary basis. Everybody in the world's got to pledge to themselves that 1 or 2 children is it. Not doing it will be catastrophic. We'll have 8 degrees, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in 30 or 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people that are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan, and living conditions will be intolerable. The droughts will be so bad there'll be no more corn growing. Not doing it is suicide.
Unbelievably, when Turner met with other globalists, David Rockefeller, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Michael Bloomberg, and even Oprah Winfrey to discuss population control, they were portrayed as superheroes.
Behind closed doors on this New York campus, a secret gathering of some of the world's most powerful people. Gates, Buffett, Bloomberg, Winfrey. It was like the Super Friends.
In the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's 4 greatest heroes.
Together with others at the meeting, including George Soros, Ted Turner, David Rockefeller, they're worth more than 120.
Let's stop that. Let's stop that, because they're worth a lot more than $125 billion at this point. These are the superheroes? Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Michael Bloomberg, David Rockefeller, Ted Turner, and George Soros. Let's sprinkle a little celebrity Oprah in there. Are you out of your mind? They're the super best friends? These people don't have your best interests at heart at all. At all.
$25 billion. The new Superman and Wonder Woman. The super rich friends. Not fighting bad guys, but fighting for good nonetheless.
Would a superhero call for a one-child policy? Would a superhero call for population control? In a recent interview, he claims that 2 billion people would be ideal. That means 4 billion plus must die to accommodate a man who owns more acreage than anyone else on the planet. Let's not forget that Ted Turner is the president of the United Nations Foundation. There are countless examples of how we are being indoctrinated to accept these kind of conditions and believe that man and his activities are the problem. From the promotion of climate cops,
we're the carbon cops and we're on the lookout for energy wasters,
to phony liberals and conservatives getting together to promote climate change.
Hell, let's face it, we're polar opposites. We couldn't be further apart. I'm on the left, and I'm usually right. And we strongly disagree. Except on one issue. Tell them what it is, Reverend Pat. That would be our planet. Taking care of it is extremely important. We all need to work together, liberals and conservatives. So get involved. It's the right thing to do. Now there you go again.
Oh, look at that. 2 sellouts, huh? On the left and the right. Isn't that lovely? It's 2 huge sellouts. You know, Al Sharpton, who's an FBI informant, who Michael Franchese said was a guy that you hired. He called him a hired gun, not as a killer or anything like that, but somebody who worked with the mafia. Okay, somebody that got stuff done. He's not a good person. Al Sharpton is not a good person. Pat Robertson is not a good person. Okay, I promise you that. On both sides, shilling for this. For world government. That's what this is about. So if you want to watch the rest of that, that's the section on climate change, but it's an over 2-hour movie. I totally encourage you to do so. Guys, if you are not subscribed, please, please, please make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Thumbs the video up. Make sure the notifications are on. Is anybody else having this problem? I've noticed that my thumbnails that I work really hard on sometimes aren't coming up. So let me know in the comments whether or not you're seeing my thumbnails. I sure hope you are. I spend a lot of time on them, guys. And make sure, We Are Change, doing 1 video a day there every day of the week. 6 days, actually. I take Mondays off. I have some other stuff I got to do. And then we do 3 videos a day over here on the News for a Change channel. Tons of stuff. Luke does great work. I love working with him. But guys, it's really hard for me to get this stuff out. Here, take a look. So my Assange video, my congressman talking about his vision for a new world order, those demonetized. Only my Moby video where he talks about rubbing his naked penis on the president at a party before he was president, that one stayed green for some reason. But Trump talking about the military-industrial complex, nope, nope. The dancing Israelis, 47-minute plus expose, no. Even talking about the death of Isaac Cappy. So quite a bit of my last few videos have been demonetized. And again, that hurts the circulation of these videos. So please, guys, like I said, share this on social media. Get it on the Reddit. Vote your own vlogs, Facebook, even... I don't know, whatever's out there, whatever you guys are using, because I'm not using a lot of social media outside of Twitter. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be doing a lot more of these exposés and deep dives throughout the week, but we couldn't do it without your support. So I do want to remind everybody, Bilderberg, it's coming up. Do we know when? Do we know where? Not exactly, although an inside source, one of the journalists that's been covering it for years, has told me he believes it will be next weekend, next Friday through Sunday, does not have a location. Another independent journalist literally sent me something a couple hours ago that makes her believe that it's going to be in Ottawa, Canada. If it's in Ottawa, Canada, more than likely I'm going to be able to be on the ground there with Luke Rudowski. If not, if it's not in Canada, Mexico, or the United States, Luke will still be covering it on the ground, and we will be getting as much out to you as humanly possible. So please consider going to that GoFundMe and supporting us there as well. Guys, once again, thank you so much. I really do appreciate the audience. So make sure you're subscribed, join the Burmis Brigade, and we will see you soon.